right, so good morning, everybody. My name is Jesse, and I am with Exploring by the Seat of Your Pants. If you're joining us for the first time, live or on YouTube, we are all about bringing conservation, adventure, and science into classrooms around the world. And we are just wrapping up the craziest month in our existence as an organization. If you didn't have the chance to check us out in May, we did over 40 normal live broadcasts. We did our Global Biodiversity Festival with 150 programs in 3 days, so 72 straight hours of broadcasting because we hate sleep here. That was a really great time. We're slowly but surely releasing all of those programs onto our YouTube channel. So if you want to check out conservationists from, I think, over 55 countries around the world and every continent, do check out that amazing festival site. We also are just wrapping up our official Backyard Bio Global Nature campaign. So we had you guys, teachers and partners all around the world out exploring the natural world near them, sharing images of local wildlife. It's been so exciting seeing what you guys have all discovered on Twitter, on iNaturalist, connecting with one another. It's just amazing. And so we could have taken June off. We could have relaxed into June, but no, we decided to kick it off with a bang. And so happy Pride Month, everybody. It is so exciting to get to do this for the very first time, where we open up June with a slate of 3 back-to-back-to-back speakers, LGBTQ speakers. And so it's so exciting to get to feature some really top-notch research, some awesome science and exploration. And so thank you guys for joining us. I know it's been a really big hit on Twitter and highlighting this amazing series of programs on social media today. So thank you if you're tuning in from the first time in the UK, in the US, in Canada, or beyond. A pleasure having you all. What an awesome way to start then with one of my very favorite topics here at Exploring by the Seat of Your Pants, and that is Antarctica. So we are joined live by Hugh Griffiths, and he is with the British Antarctic Survey and has spent over 20 years working in and around Antarctica, highlighting all the incredible biodiversity there. I think a lot of us, when we think about biodiversity, we think about coral reefs or tropical jungles, but at the bottom of the world, there's so much to discover. And what's more, so much unique stuff to discover. Some of the most fantastical life forms on this planet exist at our southern hemisphere. And so I'm so excited to dive in with Hugh to learn a little bit about his work and some of those fantastic creatures. Hugh, thank you so much for joining us today, and looking very forward to having you take us away.
Thank you very much, and thanks for having me. And I'm sorry I got you all up so early in the morning for this, but it's the middle of the afternoon for me here. So I'm just going to share my screen, and hopefully you can see that fine. And so that's me. I'm not actually as big as Antarctica. That's me giving a presentation, but it's to give you an idea of where Antarctica is and what shape Antarctica is. So a lot of people just see it as a line at the bottom of a map, and you don't really get the idea of how big it is. It's a whole continent, and in winter the sea around it freezes and doubles its size. So it's it's the coldest place on Earth. It's the highest, driest, windiest continent on Earth, and a lot of the facts we know about it, are all about the land and the ice. And I'm going to take you a little bit further into what really lives in Antarctica as well. But before I can take you to what lives there, I'm going to tell you a little bit about myself. So this is me with a red circle around my head, that adorable child that had just won some swimming medals in West Wales. And you can see the village that I grew up in right by the sea. So it's no coincidence that I ended up as a marine biologist. I was probably too lazy to look beyond my own back door and have a look at what was living nearby. And that's what I study. I study things that live in the sea. And that's where my little village is. So it couldn't be further from Antarctica. It's thousands of miles away from where I work these days, but it really did inspire me. And with views like that from my back garden, then you really can see why I became completely obsessed with the ocean and just loved everything about it. And especially the animals that live there. So this is a velvet swimming crab, and I just love the bright red eyes and the purple claws, and just everything about these animals are amazing, but they're quite aggressive. So they're one of those things that when you're a child, you have to learn how to pick them up or they're going to nip you. But my job has taken me all over the world. So the red dots are where I've done field work, and the yellow dots are where I've been to conferences and meetings and things. And like I said, one of the useful things about this map is to show you that Antarctica is often seen as this kind of strip at the bottom of the map of the world. And you'll see in a lot of world maps, they don't even include it at all. Or even if you've got a globe in your classrooms, it'll be the bit where the pole goes in, so you won't even see it. So I'm going to take you to a world that you may not even really know the shape of, this continent. So this is an image of the world from space, and you can see the sea ice around Antarctica and this huge white continent. And it really is white. It's covered in ice. But it's also at the middle of the world. If we switch that map around, and instead of concentrating on the places where people live, and you look at where the oceans are, you can see that there is huge connectivity around the world between Antarctica and the rest of the world, which you don't see on those normal maps. It's part of the connections between every ocean on Earth is connected through Antarctica. And when you get down there, it's really cold. And so the land is completely covered in ice. But we also have in the middle picture here what we call ice shelves, which are huge slabs of ice that are floating on the ocean. And it's freshwater ice. So it's ice that thousands or millions of years ago landed on Antarctica as snow and then spreads out into the rest of the ocean like rivers of ice coming off the land. And then you also have frozen ocean, so sea ice, where the actual sea itself freezes. And here's me standing on an ice shelf. So ice shelves are big enough that if you add all the ice shelves together, it's bigger than a country like South Africa. So there's a huge area, 1.6 million square kilometers covered by ice shelves. And some of them are so thick that you can build stations on them and people live and work on top of ice shelves. But if you go onto the land itself, most of the land is covered in ice. Only about 0.4% of the surface of Antarctica is free of snow and ice. And the Antarctic ice sheet is over 4 kilometers thick in parts. So imagine that, standing somewhere and 4 kilometers above your head, there is ice still going up and up and up. And it blows my mind that there can be so much ice anywhere. And we also have tiny amounts of life on those very small areas of ice-free land. So we have mosses, lichens, what are called liverworts, which are very simple plants. And in a few warmer places, tussock grass, which is a simple form of grass. And then the biggest land animals are actually just springtails, mites, tardigrades or water bears. And the biggest of them all is a wingless insect. So we don't count the penguins and seals and things as being land animals because they spend most of their lives in the ocean. So getting to the bit that's my favorite bit, which is life in the sea, it's a lot more complicated. So this diagram kind of gives you a summary of the different levels of life in the ocean. And you have at the top, well, you've got around 20,000 species for a start estimated for Antarctica. And most people see Antarctica as a big white desert and wouldn't think of that many animals there. And only about 90 of those species are the cute, cuddly, fluffy, feathered things like penguins and seals and whales and things that you would recognize as Antarctic animals. But here's a few clips of them anyway, because everybody loves a penguin. So here's a bunch of Adelie penguins, which are probably the most feisty and adorable of all the penguins. And they were swimming away from our ship because they were scared of the huge blue ship that was coming towards them. And you'll see that one of them doesn't go the same way as all of the others, and it jumps out the other side. But they're completely adapted to living in really cold temperatures, and they even nest on the continent of Antarctica itself. And here's, to give you an example of all the cute stuff, here's one set of photographs from one expedition of animals that I took pictures of without even having to leave the ship. So these are things that came up to us, things that came so close that I could get photographs like this with a fairly normal camera. So Antarctic animals are just not used to human beings. They're not scared of us. It's like nowhere else on Earth where these animals have come up to see what we are because they just think that we're another interesting thing in their environment. And here are some whales, some minke whales that were racing the ship. So they spend their whole lives in amongst the sea ice. So they find small cracks and gaps in the sea ice so they can breathe. But these ones just seem to be having a lot of fun following the ship, chasing us, and seeing if they could beat us through the gaps in the ice and things. So it's quite amazing that these animals, huge whales like these, will come and see us rather than us having to go looking for them. And these are quite amazing things to see, but they're not what I study. I study the really freaky animals. So this is a sea spider, and it's not technically a spider, but because they look like spiders, people call them sea spiders. And this one has 12 walking legs, and but other species normally have about 8. And if you probably have sea spiders anywhere in the ocean around where you live, but generally they're much smaller than the Antarctic ones. So in the UK, a sea spider might be the size of my little fingernail, or maybe my thumbnail if it's a big one for the UK. Whereas in the deep sea and in Antarctica, these things can get to the size of a dinner plate. So about that big. They're absolutely huge. But they're completely harmless to us. And for anyone who doesn't like them, just think of this amazing fact that when the females lay the eggs, she hands them all over to the male, and he has to do all the parenting responsibilities from then on. And he's even got a special pair of legs just for holding the eggs and being a good dad. So back to this diagram, and in the middle of the ocean, in that kind of bit between the surface and the seafloor, there's around 700 species. And of these, probably the most important one is Antarctic krill. It's the thing that all the penguin, seals, and whales and things eat. But it also provides food for the animals below, because its poop actually sinks down and takes a lot of food and energy down to the bottom of the sea. But the other 19,000 or so species are creatures that live at the bottom of the sea. And they're the really freaky things, the things with lots of legs, or the things with no legs, the things with lots of eyes or no eyes. And, you can have 1 meter long worms that are covered in mucus. You can have fish with antifreeze in their blood. There's a whole range of very, very interesting animals that live in Antarctica. And all of them are adapted to living in water that's colder than -2 degrees centigrade. And I bet some of you be surprised to see that there's life and color that's this rich at the bottom of the sea in Antarctica. So you've got that cold white, the biggest desert in the world at the surface. And below the surface, we've got this amazing array of sponges, soft corals, things called sea squirts. We have relatives of starfish. We have huge starfish as well, but we have things like feather stars, which are these bright orange things you can see. They're more related to a sea urchin and a starfish than they are to anything else. And types of animals that have existed long before the dinosaurs existed, but that we don't see that often in the rest of the world. And here's a nice picture that just shows you the range of colors and shapes and sizes of animals. We have everything from octopus to huge sea cucumbers, or sea anemones, the types of things you find on a rock in a rock pool or something, but they can be 1 meter long. And we have giant starfish with 50 arms that, instead of living like normal starfish, kind of wandering around scraping things off rocks, these ones wave their tentacles in the air and actually catch live krill out of the water column. And we also have some really interesting sort of animals that you might see in other places, but these ones are really specially adapted to living in cold temperatures. So things like limpets, or starfish, like I've talked about, and things that you would see on a normal beach, like mollusks, are all really well adapted to the cold. But it also makes them really sensitive to things like climate change. So these animals can live at -2 degrees centigrade, but they've changed their bodies and their physiology, so the way their bodies work, to adapt to that cold, which means that many of them, if you warm them up by 1 degree or 2, can no longer do basic functions, like the clams can't bury themselves in the mud anymore and things. So we have to be really careful and study these animals to see how they're going to cope with the changes that are coming with climate change. And so after a little bit of doom and gloom about climate change, I'm going to show you a really cool video now that shows you how these animals live and what they look like when they're there at the bottom of the sea. So here's some big sponges with some of those feather stars that I was talking about living on top of them. Here's a coral and a soft coral. And here's a sea squirt with an isopod crustacean on top of it and a worm in a tube behind it. And just here you've got a fish living inside a sponge. And these things are all normally living in total darkness. So this fish is getting its first ever proper full dose of light from the camera, and it's using it to its best advantage. Here's one of those fish that I talked about that has antifreeze in its blood, and it's trying to nudge the octopus out the way. And these sponges here are close to 1.5 meters, 2 meters tall, and they've got giant brittle stars, which are another relative of the starfish, waving their tentacles in the water, waiting for krill. And those feather stars that I told you about are swimming here because they've been disturbed by the robot that we use. And this is how they look when they're swimming. They look a bit like aliens. And here again, I told you about the giant sea anemones. Well, this is a whole garden made up of sponges, corals, and sea anemones. And Antarctica has some of the highest biomass, so weight of animals, anywhere in the world, because there's so much food rains down from the 24-hour sunlight in summer that we end up getting some really big animals, but they grow very slowly. And some of the sponges you can see in pictures like this could be 10 to 15,000 years old, which blows my mind, because, you know, that goes back to sort of the time of way before we had industrial anything. These animals have been alive longer than most civilizations. So it's amazing to see them. And we find new types of creatures all the time. So somewhere between 10 and 20% of all the animals we find every time we go there are new to science, which leaves us with the job of finding the right people to identify them to start with, because would you know that these two creatures were sea cucumbers? Because that's what they are. And interestingly as well, we found so many new species of sea cucumber on one expedition that the people in Australia who were identifying them for us came back to us twice and said, can we use your names to name some of the new species afterwards? So the first one that got named after me was the Colostoneura griffithsii. So that Griffiths is my surname. And then you've got Euthionelida huei, which is my first name is Hugh, H-U-W. And it's a huge honor to have two species named after you, but there's not many places in the world where you can go and find so many new species that they have to come back and ask you twice. So I just going up to the end of my talk now, but it is Pride Month, and I really want to thank you all for coming along and celebrating Pride Month as well. And this is a progress pride flag, which includes more than just the rainbow colors. It also includes colors that represent people of color and the trans community and other groups. So it's a really cool flag because it's very inclusive and covers everybody. And I happen to make this one out of the colors of the animals that we find at the bottom of the sea. And some of I cheated a little bit, and I've used a penguin for the black stripe, and you can just see its eye in the picture. But basically, Antarctica is full of biodiversity. All that biodiversity is sensitive to climate change, and we're already seeing things like some penguin populations are moving around because of the warming up. So I just want to get the message across that Antarctica is beautiful and really special, but it does need us to look after it, even though it's so far away and so cold. Thank you very much.
Hugh, that was unbelievable, fantastic. If you want to get me that flag, I'll actually put that in the background for our next two programs. So please do send me that when we're done this broadcast. What a neat thing. Penguin eye and all. If you want to come out of screen share and then, yeah, have a bit of a conversation with us, we have at least 9 other classes on YouTube, so 350 plus kids across the continent watching this. Welcome to all of you. You actually, when you showed the picture of all the deep sea creatures, I've almost never seen this in over 1,000 broadcasts. Like, just there's this like string of wows. Like everyone's like, oh my God, look at that amazing wildlife. And that's a pretty special thing to have. So guys, let's dive in with questions. If you're on YouTube, if you haven't let me know where you're joining from, please do. Please share questions in the chat bar. And what we're going to do first is go live to Ms. Rob joining us for her first ever on-camera broadcast, which is pretty exciting. So we're going to head to Ottawa. Hey, Ms. Rob. Welcome in. Oh, nice pink bird behind you. I don't know if that's a penguin. What's going on there?
Oh, can you see? It's a loon.
It's a loon. Oh, our favorite bird.
Yeah. It's a loon. I didn't. It's an heirloom in the family. It was passed down. I did not capture the loon.
Bird lovers galore. If you want to kick us off with the first question, go for it.
We were curious. I understand that, Hugh, you said it's really warm, but in fact, you said it's 25 degrees to get today. And one of my students was wondering, when you're out in your expeditions, what kind of clothing do you have to wear to do that kind of activity? How cold does it get?
That's a really good question. And the key is layers. So I'm guessing some of you in North America where you can get some really cold winters. So it's the same as when you're preparing to go outside in winter. You really layer up. So we have long johns and all those kind of really old-fashioned long underwear, but usually in kind of fancy modern fabrics and things. But it's basically lots of layers. And the interesting thing about Antarctica is it's so cold that it's dry. So you don't get so much of the damp in the air. So when I'm cycling to work in Cambridge in the UK, where it doesn't really get much colder than about -5 degrees centigrade in winter, it actually feels colder because the damp gets through your clothing. Whereas in Antarctica, where it's really dry, the warm air that's trapped in your layers of clothes really works because the damp's not spoiling that for you. So sometimes I get too hot working in minus 20 degrees centigrade in Antarctica because the layers work really well. So it's a matter of, you always got hats, but do you want 2 hats? And do you want 2 pairs of gloves, a thin pair and a thick pair that's waterproof and things? So you just basically layer up. And if you're like me and you work on the ship, you're really lucky because if you get too cold, you can go indoors. The people who are really good at dressing up for the cold are the geologists and glaciologists who actually work on the continent, and they sleep in tents that are on the ice. And they'll have to sometimes sleep in their clothes because their tent might blow away. And they'll sleep with their toothpaste in their sleeping bag to keep it warm so they can use it in the morning and it won't be all frozen up.
I love these sorts of stories. It's always a question we get whenever we go to either one of the poles, so to speak. And so one of my favorite stories of my own books that I've ever read on our Antarctic expeditions is, the Scott expeditions and these like iconic tales of adventure. It's negative 50 so often that when it gets to be like negative 20, they're just stripping off clothes. They're like, oh, it's so sweltering here. It's brutal. I love those sorts of tales. So thank you for that, Ms. Raw. Great first question. Ms. Cazzola, I know your devices aren't on today because you're sharing on Teams. If you want to share in the chat, I'll come to you guys in just a minute. But what I want to do now is stay in Ottawa for a minute, go to OCD Alternative 5/6s with Ms. Crowther's group. Hi, guys.
Good morning, Jesse.
Good
morning.
Yeah.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, perfect. If you want to share.
Okay. Thanks so much to you for all this amazing information and imagery. We are studying biodiversity with our grade 6 classes.
You're muted, Ms. Crowther.
But
yeah, we can't hear you.
The team is one of my favorite things in all our broadcasts is when a teacher's talking to us on StreamYard, they have to mute their kids and then the kids are like heckling them. You can roll.
Can you hear me now?
We're good.
All right, I apologize. It's learning all those new technical things when you're doing 7 or 8 different things at a time. So we are just discussing biodiversity in our grade 6 curriculum in Ottawa right now. And one of the questions we had is, with climate change and the melting of the ice, what is the impact on the species on the ocean floor?
That's a really good question. So we aren't 100% certain how it's going to work. So we're doing experiments and things. We're actually putting what are called settlement panels, which are blocks that resemble stone, but we see what animals land and start to grow on them. And we've actually started warming some of those panels up to see how that affects which animals survive. And we see that there are some winners and some losers. So we have some species that are actually probably don't really like the cold, but are just able to tolerate it. And we see that they do a lot better when we warm it up. But all these really cold specialist animals do suffer quite badly when we warm it up. So there are some species we think will adapt over time if climate change isn't too fast. But there are others we think just will have to keep shrinking back and back into the deep sea and other cold places like underneath the ice shelves. But there's a limit to how far south you can go in Antarctica because there's land in the middle. So in the Arctic, we see things moving further north all the time. In Antarctica, you can't keep moving south because you'll have to become a land animal otherwise. But on land, the opposite is true. So the plants and things actually like it when it's warmer. So we're seeing parts of Antarctica getting greener. So it seems strange to say that a bad effect of climate change is more biodiversity on land, but that's something that is happening.
It's a very, you have so much experience in these places. I love that diagram of all the places you got a chance to research in Antarctica. So you're one of the people who can speak to this more than almost anyone else, but there's not that many, relatively speaking, expeditions happening in Antarctica compared to somewhere like South America, North America, Europe. It's fairly difficult and expensive to get down there and to actually do this sort of research. So I love these questions, and I think, you're looking for an answer, guys. That's a fantastic overview of everything. We'll also share at the end some of the British Antarctic Survey's resources, which is sort of the ultimate tool if you want to learn more about this topic. So thanks, guys. Mr. Green's class, grade 8, joining us in Brampton. If you guys want to come on in, ask away.
Hey, we've done a couple of tasks involving robots this year, and we were wondering about the robot that you use to go down really deep underwater there. Is it like autonomous? Does it have any kind of coding involved, or do you have to steer it from like a mechanism, like a joystick or something? And then the other thing was, do you use the robot because humans can't go that deep for any particular reason?
Well, that's cool. That's a complete. I never had this question before, so that's a really good question. So I would say that we use a whole range of different autonomous vehicles and robots and things. So we have everything from ocean gliders, which we just program and send off, and they communicate with us on a regular basis, and we give them new instructions when they need it. So they'll dive up and down in the ocean and send back signals to us about oceanography. The ROV, remotely operated vehicle that you saw in that the images from, that one is actually sort of tethered. So it has a cable that goes down to it and is getting direct signals from an operator who's actually living in a shipping container and has a full array of screens and things and can control that. But we have some other devices that we tow behind the ship that can be pulled up and down, so they hover above the seafloor collecting video and footage and stuff. And then we have other things that are called moorings, where we actually have a huge buoy or buoy, as you might say in the US, which is full of air, and that will be underwater and connected to a weight at the bottom. And then we connect all sorts of devices to that cable in between. And they send back loads of information about things like how many fish are swimming past and things from using echolocation and things. So we use a whole range of technology, but the worst thing is that it's cold and wet in Antarctica under the ocean. So there's salt, which rusts all these things. The cold kills battery life a lot. So we have to be very careful where we're using new technology, because it would be very easy to lose it under an iceberg, for example. So some of the stuff we do is very low tech, but when we use high tech, we have to normally make it the most extreme version of the high tech we can.
I love when we get to talk about these robots. So one of the things we've had on this broadcast before is the RV Falcor and the EV Nautilus. So two really fantastic research vessels. So if you want to see programs all on the robotics and the UAVs and all sorts of amazing stuff that's going on under the ice, under the sea, that these expeditions get to use, do check that out, Mr. Green, because it's very, very cool. Guys, I'm going to go ahead to YouTube for a minute. Miss Byrne, I'm coming to you next when we come live. But I want to take a question from Maria in Miss Viren's class in Bowmanville. She wants to know, how long do penguins live? You started with penguins. You had to expect some penguin questions. Tell us about the Adelies.
Adelies are small and they're feisty. They're amazing. And they'll follow you on the beach and chase you. And they're hilarious at the same time, because they'll probably fall over. But in general, for birds, penguins can live quite a long time. So albatrosses and things live a really long time, like over 50 years. But some of the penguins can live for decades. But I think the smaller penguins get, the less long they live. So emperor penguins and king penguins and things live much longer than some of the other species. But to be fair, penguins aren't just an Antarctic animal. There are more species of penguin that live in South America than live on the continent of Antarctica itself. So we only have 2 species that really live on the continent. Yeah. But yeah, they can live a decent life for a bird. Let's put it that way.
Yeah, I always marvel at the fact with emperor penguins too, is how big they are. Like they're like 3.5, 4 feet tall. That's a huge animal, right? Like that's, it's the height of some of the kids in some of these classes today, which is wild to think about. I also, that Adelie penguin video, the one, if you guys go back and watch this video after the fact on YouTube, I just picture the look on his face being like, I'm on the wrong iceberg. It's just terrible. It's fantastic. Great. Let's head to Miss Cook's class. They want to know, what animal's the top of the food chain in Antarctica, Hugh?
Oh, that's quite an easy one, actually, because there's a very short food chain. So you remember I told you about krill, which is like the most important animal in Antarctica. It's basically a little perfect bag of food. And beneath that is the phytoplankton, so tiny plants. And then you have this straight up jump to big animals straight after that. So you have fish and things that eat krill, but more than that, you have leopard seals, and you have squid, and you have whales and albatrosses, and everything eats krill. And then you have one species that sits above all of those other really important predators, and that's the killer whale, or the orca. And there's something like 160,000 individual orca around Antarctica, and they have ones that hunt seals, ones that hunt whales, ones that hunt fish, ones that hunt squid, because different orca families have different hunting strategies. But it's amazing that the orca really are the top predator, and they'll eat everything from the penguins, the seals, and everything else. So you've got this kind of jump between tiny, tiny plants, krill, and then you suddenly have big animals, and then one big predator on top of that. So even the blue whales and things can be hunted by killer whales.
I'm so glad you mentioned that at the end. It's one of my favorite things about them. First of all, I encourage all our students, when you're done this program, look up a killer whale skull. This is the most metal skull in the entire animal kingdom. It's like scarier than any dinosaurs. It's quite amazing. They're the only animal in the ocean. We've recorded them hunting blue whales, the largest creature ever to live on this planet, and we've recorded them hunting great white sharks, which I think most people think of as sort of like the apex ocean predator. Also, 160,000 orcas have been recorded in Antarctica. There's nothing, okay, this is like a nerdy biology thing, but you were talking about the biomass in Antarctica. Nothing says rich ecosystem more than the fact that a place can support that many apex predators. That is crazy. That's an insanely high number. I know when we're thinking of people, we think of cities of millions, but like there's never 160,000 big predators. That is very, very cool. Awesome. That was cool. Thank you for that. I'm learning something new every day. Let's head to Miss Burns' class, and then I'll head to Miss Yu. I know you're sharing your questions online. So Miss Burns, come on in.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, so my grade 7 class is wondering what the most biologically complex creature you've come across in Antarctica is.
Oh, that's a really difficult question. So we have, if you're talking about just complex in terms of behavior and things like that, octopus are amazing. When we catch an octopus, you see something in their eyes. You see that they're looking at you and working out what you are. And some of the other animals, you'd be like a penguin, really they're hilarious because they're a little bit dumb. Their eyeballs are technically about the same size or bigger than their brain. So they're really good at what they do, but they show no fear because they probably don't even understand what you are. But we see lots of very simple life, very old styles of life, like I say, kind of pre-dinosaurs, because it's so cold that some of the more modern predators and things like sharks are missing because it's too cold for sharks in Antarctica. They basically fall asleep. And we lack a lot of the types of crabs and things that we have in the rest of the world. So all the animals that are being crushed and eaten by those kind of things have got a refuge in Antarctica. So actually, the things that are most impressive to me are not the most complicated ones, but the fact that we have some of these more simple forms of life that look more like paleontology than modern day marine biology.
Yeah. You showed those feather stars, and it's always been one of my absolute favorite things in nature is watching a feather star. It is. It's like something that you would never expect would be on planet Earth. Like, it's so magical. It's so fantastical to see. So yeah, a great question, guys. I forgot to mention this whole time. I'd encourage all our classes, when you're done, check out Blue Planet 2 if you ever get the chance. Like, it is has the most amazing cinematography of deep sea wildlife you will ever see ever. Blue Planet 2, BBC series, probably the best natural history series and program in that series ever made. So yeah, I hope our classes get that chance. Miss Yu's class, I know your devices aren't working today, unfortunately, but they want to know how big do the ice bridges get, I guess, between these icebergs or between these ice floats, and how are you able to measure how thick the ice is, which I think is a great question.
So very often we can use radar and things to measure how thick the ice is, and we also have satellites and things that we use for lots of things, but the icebergs get absolutely enormous. So we can have individual icebergs that are, way bigger than Manhattan or way bigger than, they always say, the size of Wales or whatever. And you end up with these kind of huge slabs of ice, which can cover thousands of square kilometers, but they eventually break up as they move away from the land because the ocean moves around and they form smaller and smaller bits. And you may have heard of the iceberg A68, which was the biggest iceberg in the world and things like that. So they're huge, but they come from these ice shelves, which cover about a third of the shelf of Antarctica. And that's about 1.6 million square kilometers. And we know very little about what lives under there. There's ocean under these ice shelves. We know they're floating, but in total, we've seen about the size of a tennis court's worth of sea floor from under these ice shelves. So they're a mystery environment. And only this year we published a paper about the first sponges that were living 260 kilometers from their nearest food source. So there's a big mystery about this ice that eventually forms icebergs. And icebergs themselves are a really amazing part of the Antarctic ecosystem because as they move around, they go into shallower water. And imagine just taking a bulldozer and plowing all the life in a forest, like destroying it by just pushing it. That's what these icebergs do to that sea floor. So some places where the sponges live thousands of years, and other places where they never get to grow at all because the icebergs are just plowing them to pieces. So Antarctica is very dynamic in a lot of ways, but the sea ice helps. In the winter, it holds the icebergs still, so they do less damage. And that's one of the worrying things about climate change, is if we lose the sea ice, there'll be more damage to the seafloor.
Fantastic. This is so neat. I love it. Sorry, professional detachment is just out the window today, and I think that's going to continue with our next two programs as well. I want to share a quick one from YouTube. We are whipping through these questions. You're like a master question answerer. This is great. So we've got time for all our live classes again. I want to head to Miss Holman's really quick. She wants to know, you highlighted these two species named after you, which, by the way, for our classes that might not know, that's such an honor. It's such a rare thing to have that happen. So lucky you, and what a cool place to be where that's possible. They wanted to know, have you personally discovered any new species? And if so, like, did you name them for anything else, anyone else in particular?
So I've discovered a lot of new things, but to be honest, I didn't really know they were new when we found them, because I'm not a taxonomist. So taxonomists are really specially trained scientists. And I think Paul, who's coming on, would class himself as a taxonomist, and you get to speak to him later about some Arctic plants, I think. But basically, they're specialists who work in museums and labs, and they do a lot more detailed work than I do. And they'll use microscopes and things and really definitely check. And then they'll also test the DNA to see if it's a new species. So I'm not as clever as them. I'm not as skilled as them. They are real experts. So what I do is I look at the bigger picture about where things live and why we find them there and why we don't find them somewhere else. But I leave the really technical stuff to people who dedicate their whole lives to one group of animals. So not even, sometimes it's just one family of sea cucumbers that somebody specializes in, and they did their whole PhD on it and everything. So these people are amazing. And without them, we wouldn't have names for any animals.
That was a very humble story. I love how everyone comes on and they're like, you know what? I'm like the least clever of the people you bring on those broadcasts, and everyone does that. And I think Paul's probably going to come on and be like, man, I wish I was as clever as you. It's kind of a nice thing. But I like the shout out for taxonomists, and for any adult audience. Why Fish Don't Exist, which is a really recently released book, is a fantastic dive into taxonomy and some other deep topics that I've read recently. So Why Fish Don't Exist, a very cool book as a nice follow-up to that speech by Hugh. Guys, let's flip through another round of questions. You guys are so enthusiastic, and I love it. So Miss Robin, coming back to you guys in Ottawa, take us away.
Hi there. So one of my students was curious looking at the penguins. Did penguins used to fly, or have they always been flightless in terms of their adaptation to their environment?
So penguins are just flightless birds, but they come from flying relatives, but a very long way back. So the penguins we have in Antarctica today have been there for about 2 million years. But before that, there were other types of penguins. So penguins have been around for at least 40 million years, I think. And this will blow your mind. So Jesse was talking about how big the penguins are today, the emperor penguins. We had fossil penguins from Antarctica and parts of New Zealand and other places that are taller than me. They're probably more like 6'6", 6'7" in height, 1.9 2 meters tall, something like that. And that blows my mind. Absolutely enormous penguins. But they're relatives of the penguins we have today. But again, they became flightless a long time ago, penguins did. And there are a few main lines of penguins. You have the yellow-eyed penguins, and you have the crested penguins, and then you have the emperors and the kings are a different group. So you have a few different families of penguins, but we've had different families of penguins in the past as well. So they've been flightless a long time. And similarly, we had penguins are actually named after the scientific name for the great auk, which was actually a northern Arctic bird, which didn't fly either, but looked a lot like a penguin. And if you ever see one in a museum, you'll see why people called the penguins after that creature that they'd already seen in the Arctic, because it's now extinct. Humans deliberately made the great auk extinct, which is really sad. But it's a good lesson for the rest of the world. And I think it's worth looking up great auks just to find out how badly humans treated that species, so we can learn how to treat other ones better.
I'm going to pull this up in the broadcast just if people don't know how to spell it. Great auk is really quite one of the iconic stories of extinction. I mean, of course, a lot of us might have heard of the dodo, another example of a bird that we literally just killed for fun on an island and wiped out in the last few hundred years, which is a really tragic story. On a positive note, I did put in the YouTube chat anyway a link to that giant penguin. If you want to see it, it's quite the wild illustration of how big this creature got. The world that we exist in today is really an impoverished version of what it was even 5,000-10,000 years ago because of all the species that we've wiped out. And I think that's an important cautionary tale when we're thinking about sort of preserving species and habitats today. We don't want to lose the elephant or the manatee or great white sharks. It really behooves us all to do, small things to really make a positive difference because the world is richer with these creatures, as I think we all got the chance to see today. Let's head to our Miss Crowther's class, and then we'll take questions from Miss Byrne in a minute. Miss Cazzola and Miss Yu, if you want to share some in the chat, please do. But Miss Crowther, take us away.
Hi, thanks again. Oliver has a question. He wonders, in addition to studying the ocean floor and the waters, do you study what's in the ice? Have you ever made any discoveries about frozen creatures in the ice?
That's a really good question. So there's different types of ice. So there's the ice on land, and I've got colleagues who are trying to work out how to drill down to some of the lakes that are under the ice, and there could be anything living in there. I'm not saying there'll be sea monsters or anything, but there could be forms of life that we haven't seen for millions of years in the outside world. We also have colleagues who study, there are microbes that live in the snow and ice. So you get green ice sometimes in Antarctica where there are plants growing in the ice. And then there's sea ice. And sea ice is amazing because that forms when the sea actually freezes. And as it freezes, microscopic plants and animals get frozen in with it. And they live in these really salty water channels called brine channels, and they'll be living in there and enough light gets through. And actually, one of the things that makes Antarctica so amazing is that when the spring and summer comes and the sea ice starts to melt, it's got a head start in terms of plankton because all this plankton's been living in the ice over winter. So that seeds the ocean. It's like chucking a whole load of new plankton in to start the spring. So it makes Antarctica incredibly rich. So you've got tiny animals living in the sea ice, tiny microbes and things living in the snow, and then you've also got whatever is living underneath in the lakes that are trapped underneath the ice sheets.
It's like the plot of a sci-fi film. Like, I'd love to see a movie where they like drill through the ice to one of these, like, the fact that there are giant lakes and not tiny lakes, like gigantic lakes underneath the ice. I think there's a Lake Vostok, if I'm not mistaken, it's like the size of Lake Ontario or something. Like, it's gigantic. It's a monster lake. And it's under this huge ice sheet. It's just wild. It's a whole other world. But it's ours, which is so special. Hugh, we got time for 2 more questions. I could, talk all day, and I don't want to. This Hugh's class wants to know, Adrian wants to know, what's the most interesting animal you saw? No pressure at all.
That's really difficult because I've seen whales up close and things, and they're amazing to see. But actually, when you first pull out a giant sea spider that big, and you've never seen one in your life before, that is the most interesting experience, because if it's in the mud or in the gravel and you're just taking it out the net, you're kind of trying to work out, is this one animal or 2 animals? What is this, a car? And then you realize when you put it the right way up that it's a sea spider, but just like nothing you've ever seen before. So for me, that was the coolest thing.
Yeah, I love when I saw the first footage of deep sea Antarctica. And again, Blue Planet 2 does this really well. But the very first time, I was like, okay, I get those sponges and I see those sea stars, and they're sort of vaguely familiar. And then the spider comes walking by. It's like, whoa, what on earth is that? It's actually Miss Cazzola's question too, is about the oddest thing you've ever seen, strangest thing. So I think we've got that covered, guys. This has been so much fun. Again, over 350 kids from across the continent tuning in. And Hugh, you at the beginning of the broadcast, before we got underway, you shared this link with me. So if people want to check out British Antarctic Survey, amazing educational resources for kids, do check out that link. Any of our teachers who registered can email me as well, and I'll make sure you guys have that. This has been such a fun program. Is there any last message you want to share with kids who might be keen to learn more about Antarctica or about your work in particular, Hugh?
I would say, especially as it's Pride Month, I would say don't have any preconceived ideas about what an Antarctic scientist is. Anybody can work in Antarctica. I grew up on the coast of West Wales, and I even said to some friends when I finished university, why would anybody want to work in Antarctica? It's cold and it's dark and it's miserable. And it's nothing like that. It's the most amazing place I've ever been in my life. And nobody should sit there thinking Antarctica and Antarctic science isn't for them. We're not the history of Antarctic. It's not all about black and white photos of men with beards who died somewhere doing something incredibly brave. We're all well looked after. You're kept warm. They give you plenty of food, and you get to see amazing places and do amazing things. So for anybody who thinks they might want to do it, check it out and go and see that web link that Jesse's put for you, because it is an amazing place, and you might just find a career that will change your life and blow your mind.
Yeah. Hugh, there's no better message to end on than that, not just for our beginning of Pride Month with this amazing program series today, but just generally. Representation in science and space and exploration is something that we always try and focus on at Exploring by the Seat of Your Pants. And I think that more and more people are seeing themselves in roles like this, which is so special. You know, no matter what your gender, no matter what your sexual orientation, no matter where you come from, no matter the color of your skin, there are so many people doing amazing work around this planet and beyond. And so thank you so much for kicking off a really special day for us, and I really, really appreciate your time today.
Thank you for having me.
I'm going to bring in all our teachers to say a quick farewell and thank you as well. So Miss Rob, Miss Brennan, Miss Murray, if you guys want to join me before I